You chase momentary pleasures thinking they'll bring you happiness. Yet you find yourself weaker and more restless with each indulgence. Every time you give in to comfort, convenience, or instant gratification, you're trading your inner strength for a fleeting satisfaction that leaves you emptier than before. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who ruled the most powerful empire in history while mastering the discipline of desire through Stoic principles. What I discovered about pleasure and weakness will transform how you approach every temptation, showing you how to build unshakable inner strength by understanding the true nature of desire. The same philosophy that sustained me through plagues, wars, and the burden of empire can free you from the cycle of seeking pleasure that weakens your character and clouds your judgment. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to break free from the chains of pleasure seeking. When I became Emperor of Rome at 39, I inherited not just power, but the most sophisticated pleasure apparatus the world had ever known. Every conceivable comfort was at my fingertips, the finest foods from across the empire, entertainment that could make gods weep, luxuries that would bankrupt entire kingdoms, and the ability to satisfy any desire with a single word. The very palace I walked through each day was designed to intoxicate the senses and weaken the will. I remember my first week as emperor, overwhelmed by the constant stream of advisors offering me increasingly elaborate pleasures. "Caesar," they would say, "you have earned the right to enjoy the fruits of your position." They brought me wine from vineyards I had never heard of, delicacies prepared by chefs who spent their entire lives perfecting single dishes, and entertainments that grew more elaborate with each passing day. The weight of unlimited power pressed against my character like water against a dam. But I noticed something troubling in those early days. The more I indulged in these offerings, the harder it became to make difficult decisions. After a particularly lavish feast, I found myself hesitating over matters that required swift, decisive action. My judgment clouded, my will softened, and my capacity for the hard choices that leadership demands began to atrophy. The palace's luxury was not just surrounding meat was changing me. This is when I first retreated to what would become my private meditation chamber. It was a simple stone room, deliberately sparse, where I could think clearly without the fog of indulgence clouding my mind. In that space, away from the golden walls and silk cushions, I began to understand what the ancient philosophers meant when they warned about the corrupting influence of pleasure. The senators who came to me each day had grown soft and weak from years of indulgence. I could see it in their eyes, the glazed look of men who had traded their sharpness for comfort, their wisdom for wine, their strength for satisfaction. They made decisions based on what felt good rather than what was right, and the empire suffered. For it, I realized that if I followed their path, I would become just another weak ruler who chose pleasure over duty. It was in this meditation chamber that I first encountered the writings of Epictetus, the former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic philosophers. His words cut through the palace's golden haze like a sword through silk. Wealth consists in not having great possessions, but in having few wants. Here was a man who understood that true strength comes not from having everything you desire, but from mastering desire itself. The contrast between the palace's endless temptations and the simple wisdom of Stoicism became the foundation of my philosophy. I saw how the unlimited power to seek pleasure was actually the greatest threat to my ability to lead, to think clearly, and to maintain the strength that true leadership required. The very privileges of my position were tests of character, and I was determined not to fail them. **** In the 5th year of my reign, death came to Rome like a thief in the night. The Antonine Plague swept through the empire with merciless efficiency, killing perhaps 5 million souls, my subjects, my friends, my advisors. I watched the most powerful civilization in human history brought to its knees by an invisible enemy that cared nothing for our military might or political achievements. But what truly horrified me was not the plague itself, was how people responded to it. Faced with the possibility of imminent death, instead of turning toward virtue and meaning, vast numbers of my citizens abandoned themselves to frantic pleasure-seeking. If we might die tomorrow, they reasoned, then let us feast and drink and indulge today. The streets of Rome were not filled with funeral processions. Echoed with the sounds of desperate revelry, I witnessed senators spending their children's inheritance on elaborate banquets, while their own neighbors starved. Citizens drained their savings on wine and entertainment, reasoning that money meant nothing if death was coming. The gladiatorial games became more brutal and frequent as people sought increasingly intense stimulation to feel alive in the face of mortality. Brothels overflowed with those seeking to lose themselves in physical pleasure rather than confront their fear. This mass flight into hedonism revealed a truth that chilled me more than the plague itself. Pleasure-seeking is not a sign of strength or life affirmation. It is the behavior of the weak and terrified. When faced with genuine crisis, those who had built their lives around comfort and gratification completely collapsed. They had no inner resources to draw upon, no philosophy to guide them, no strength of character to sustain them. I saw families torn apart as fathers abandoned their responsibilities to chase fleeting pleasures. Soldiers deserted their posts to spend their final days in taverns and gambling dens. The very fabric of society began to unravel as people chose immediate gratification over duty, loyalty, and honor. The plague killed bodies, but pleasure-seeking was killing souls. In contrast, I observed that those who had practiced discipline and virtue, the Stoic philosophers, the dedicated soldiers, the faithful citizens who continued to serve despite the danger, these people remained strong. They faced death with dignity, continued to fulfill their duties, and maintained their humanity even as the world crumbled around them. Their strength came not from seeking pleasure, but from finding meaning in right action. During those dark years, I spent countless hours in my meditation chamber, contemplating this lesson. I wrote in my journal, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." The plague taught me that when external circumstances become uncertain, only internal strength endures. Those who had built their happiness on external pleasures found themselves defenseless when those pleasures became meaningless in the face of death. The Antonine Plague was my great teacher. It showed me that pleasure-seeking is not just morally weak, it is practically devastating. In life's crucial moments, when real strength is required, those who have trained themselves to seek comfort will find themselves utterly unprepared for the demands of reality. For 13 years, I led Roman legions against the Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier. These campaigns taught me lessons about strength and weakness that no palace philosopher could have provided. In the brutal reality of warfare, the difference between those who seek pleasure and those who embrace discipline becomes a matter of life and death. I remember my first major engagement with the Marcomanni tribe. We had been in the field for weeks, and many of my soldiers had grown restless with the hardships of campaign life. When we captured a Germanic settlement, some of the legionnaires immediately sought to reward themselves with the spoils wine, women, and comfort after the harsh conditions they had endured. I watched as these pleasure-seeking soldiers became sluggish, their fighting edge dulled by indulgence. When the Germanic counterattack came at dawn, it was these same soldiers who broke first. Men who had been sharing stolen wine the night before could not summon the clarity and sharpness needed for combat. Their reflexes were slow, their judgment impaired, their courage compromised. I saw good soldiers die because their comrades had chosen momentary pleasure over martial readiness. The contrast with my disciplined troops was stark. The soldiers who maintained their training regimen, who ate simple rations without complaint, who spent their evenings sharpening their weapons rather than dulling their senses. These men fought like wolves. They moved with precision, thought with clarity, and struck with deadly effectiveness. Their strength came not from what they consumed, but from what they abstained from consuming. I established strict rules about pleasure during campaigns. No excessive drinking, no indulgence in captured luxuries, no abandonment of discipline regardless of circumstances. Many of my officers initially resisted these measures, arguing that soldiers deserved rewards for their service. But the results spoke for themselves. Disciplined legions consistently outperformed those that had been allowed to indulge in the quiet moments between battles. Writing in my tent by candlelight, I reflected on how this principle extended beyond warfare. The Germanic tribes themselves provided a perfect example. Those tribes that lived in luxury, that had grown soft from trade wealth and comfortable settlements, fell quickly to our disciplined advance. But the tribes that maintained their traditional hardships, sleeping on the ground, eating simple foods, training constantly for battle, these gave us the fiercest resistance. I learned to see pleasure-seeking as a kind of voluntary weakening. Every time a person chooses comfort over challenge, ease over effort, gratification over growth, they diminish their capacity to handle life's inevitable difficulties. The soldier who cannot resist wine will struggle to resist fear. The man who cannot delay gratification will struggle to persist through hardship. During one particularly brutal winter siege, when my own stomach cramped with hunger and my body ached from sleeping on frozen ground, I felt the temptation to retreat to more comfortable quarters. The rational mind could construct many justifications. I needed to be sharp for strategic decisions. My health was crucial for the army's success. Surely the emperor deserved some basic comforts, but I recognized this as the voice of weakness calling. I remained with my soldiers, shared their hardships, and felt my own character strengthened by the voluntary embrace of difficulty. That winter taught me that strength is not built by avoiding discomfort, it is built by choosing to face discomfort with grace and determination. It was during my German campaigns that I first truly understood Epictetus's teaching about the inner citadel. Sitting in my command tent, surrounded by the chaos of war, I realized that every human being possesses an unconquerable fortress within their mind. They choose to build and defend it. This inner citadel becomes the source of all true strength, but pleasure-seeking is its greatest enemy. Epictetus had been a slave, yet he possessed more freedom than most emperors. How was this possible? Because he had built an impregnable fortress within his soul, a place where no external force could touch him. Physical chains could bind his body, masters could command his actions, but his inner citadel remained sovereign. He understood that we suffer not from external circumstances, but from our opinions about those circumstances. I began to see that pleasure-seeking is essentially an invasion of this inner citadel. When we allow desires for comfort, gratification, and ease to drive our decisions, we surrender command of our fortress to forces outside ourselves. We become slaves to our appetites, prisoners of our cravings, subjects of our impulses. The very seeking of pleasure opens the gates of our inner strength too. Occupying forces. Let me explain this through a battlefield metaphor that became clear to me during the siege of Sirmium. A well-defended fortress is strong not because of what it possesses, but because of what it can do without. The citadel that requires constant supply trains, luxurious provisions, and comfortable quarters is vulnerable to siege. But the fortress that can survive on simple rations, basic shelter, and minimal comforts becomes unconquerable. The human soul operates on on the same principle. When we train ourselves to require pleasure, comfort, and constant gratification, we create vulnerabilities that life will inevitably exploit. The man who cannot be happy without wine becomes a prisoner to his bottle. The person who cannot feel satisfied without luxury becomes enslaved to their possessions. The individual who requires constant entertainment becomes dependent on external stimulation for their inner peace. But when we build our inner citadel on the foundation of virtue rather than pleasure, we become unconquerable. No external force can take away our capacity for courage, wisdom, justice, and self-discipline. These treasures exist independent of circumstances, immune to the vagaries of fortune, beyond the reach of enemies or even death itself. I practiced building this inner citadel through daily disciplines. Each morning, before addressing imperial business, I would spend time in meditation, reminding myself that my happiness depended not on what happened to me, but on how I chose to respond to what happened to me. I trained myself to find satisfaction in right action rather than pleasant sensations, in virtue rather than victory, in character rather than comfort. The process was like military fortification. Every time I chose discipline over indulgence, I added another stone to the walls of my inner citadel. Every moment I delayed gratification for a higher purpose, I strengthened the defenses of my soul. Every instance where I embraced necessary hardship rather than avoiding it, I deepened the foundation of my inner strength. This inner citadel became my refuge during the darkest moments of my reign. When the plague ravaged the empire, when barbarians threatened our borders, when political intrigue swirled around me, I could retreat to this unconquerable space within my mind. There, no external chaos could disturb my peace. No pleasure could tempt me from my duty. No pain could break my resolve. The magnificent irony I discovered was that building this inner citadel, which required giving up the pursuit of pleasure, actually led to deeper satisfaction than any external indulgence could provide. The strength that comes from self-mastery, the peace that flows from virtue, the joy that springs from right action, these are pleasures that no enemy can take away. No circumstance can diminish, no passage of time can erode. Asterisk, asterisk, in my study of Stoic philosophy, I learned that there are three fundamental disciplines that govern human flourishing: the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. But I discovered that the discipline of desire is the foundation upon which all strength is built. Master your desires, and you master your life. Remain enslaved to your desires, and you remain weak regardless of your external power. The discipline of desire is deceptively simple in concept, yet demanding in practice. Desire only what is entirely within your control, and accept everything else with equanimity. This means training yourself to want virtue, wisdom, courage, and justice, qualities that no external force can take from you. It means becoming indifferent to wealth, fame, comfort, and pleasure, things that fortune can grant or remove at will. I remember the day this principle truly crystallized for me. I was holding my simple wooden drinking cup, the one I used instead of the golden goblets that adorned every imperial table. A visiting senator noticed this and commented, "Caesar, surely you deserve to drink from vessels worthy of your station." His words revealed everything wrong with how most people think about desire and worthiness. I realized that the senator believed comfort and luxury were rewards for achievement, signs of success, natural rights of those who had reached high positions. But this thinking makes strength dependent on circumstances. The emperor who requires golden cups to feel imperial is actually a slave to his need for external validation. The leader who cannot function without luxury has made his effectiveness dependent on maintaining those luxuries. In that moment, I understood that true strength comes from training desire itself. Instead of seeking to fulfill every want, I learned to examine each desire and ask, does wanting this make me stronger or weaker? Does pursuing this increase my freedom or my dependence? Most desires, I discovered, are actually forms of bondage disguised as fulfillment. Consider the difference between needs and wants. I need food to survive, but I don't need exotic delicacies from distant provinces. I need shelter, but I don't need marble floors and silk curtains. I need companionship, but I don't need constant entertainment and stimulation. When we confuse wants with needs, we multiply our vulnerabilities and diminish our strength. I developed practical exercises for training this discipline. Each morning, I would mentally rehearse losing everything I possessed: my empire, my wealth, my health, even my life. This practice, which Stoics call negative visualization, taught me to hold all external goods lightly. When you truly accept that you could lose everything tomorrow and still maintain your essential self, you become unconquerable. Another exercise involved deliberately choosing discomfort when comfort was available. I would sleep on hard surfaces when soft beds were offered, eat simple food when elaborate meals were prepared, walk when carriages were provided. These practices weren't masochistic, they were training sessions for the soul, building my capacity to remain strong regardless of circumstances. The discipline of desire also meant learning to find satisfaction in the process rather than the outcome. Instead of desiring victory in battle, I learned to desire the courage to fight well. Instead of wanting others' approval, I trained myself to want the wisdom to act rightly. Instead of seeking pleasure, I cultivated the desire for virtue. This shift in focus made my happiness dependent on my choices rather than my circumstances. Through years of practice, I discovered that disciplined desire leads to a profound paradox. When you stop chasing pleasure, you find deeper satisfaction. When you stop needing external validation, you gain genuine confidence. When you stop requiring comfort, you discover inner peace. The discipline that seems to restrict actually liberates, while the freedom to indulge every desire actually enslaves. In the palace gardens, there stood an ancient sundial that had marked time for generations of emperors. Each day, as I walked past this weathered stone timepiece, I was reminded of a fundamental truth that separates the strong from the weak: the ability to think beyond the present moment. Those who seek immediate gratification become slaves to the tyranny of now, while those who can delay satisfaction become masters of their destiny. I observed this principle constantly in my role as emperor. Senators would come to me demanding immediate solutions to complex problems, wanting the gratification of quick fixes rather than enduring the discomfort of thorough deliberation. Military commanders would push for flashy, rapid victories, rather than the slower, more sustainable strategies that would serve the empire better in the long term. Citizens would petition for immediate relief from hardships, rather than accepting the temporary sacrifices necessary for lasting prosperity. The pattern was always the same. The desire for immediate pleasure or relief created weakness, while the willingness to delay gratification built strength. I learned to recognize this distinction in myself and others, and it became one of my most reliable guides for making difficult decisions. Consider how immediate gratification affects the mind itself. When we constantly seek instant pleasure, we train our brains to expect immediate rewards for minimal effort. This creates a kind of mental weakness where we become incapable of sustaining effort toward long-term goals. The soldier who demands immediate comfort cannot endure the sustained hardship that victory requires. The leader who needs instant approval cannot make the unpopular decisions that true leadership demands. I remember a particular instance during the Germanic campaigns when this principle became starkly clear. We had besieged a fortified settlement for 3 months, and my officers were growing restless with the slow progress. Many urged me to order a direct assault that would bring quick resolution and quick glory for those involved. The immediate gratification of action was appealing to warriors who had grown tired of the tedious work of siege warfare, but I had learned to distrust the appeal of immediate solutions. I knew that a hasty assault would cost unnecessary lives and potentially fail altogether, while patience would eventually force the enemy to surrender. The immediate gratification of action had to be weighed against the long-term benefits of strategic patience. I chose patience, and the settlement eventually fell without the loss of a single Roman life. This experience taught me that immediate gratification is often the enemy of optimal outcomes. The best solutions usually require sustained effort, uncomfortable waiting periods, and the ability to resist the siren call of quick fixes. Those who cannot delay gratification consistently make suboptimal choices, because they prioritize short-term comfort over long-term results. I began to see delayed gratification as a form of time travel. It allows you to bring future benefits into the present through current discipline. When you resist immediate pleasure for a greater future good, you are essentially trading present discomfort for future strength. This exchange rate temporary discomfort for lasting benefit is one of the most powerful tools available to human beings. The neurological impact of this training fascinated me. I noticed that as I practiced delaying gratification, my capacity for sustained effort in all areas grew stronger. My ability to focus during long philosophical study sessions improved. My patience during tedious administrative work increased. My tolerance for physical discomfort during military campaigns expanded. It was as if the mental muscle that controls delay of gratification strengthened every other aspect of my character. I developed specific exercises to build this capacity. I would delay meals when hungry, postpone rest when tired, and resist the urge to immediately resolve uncomfortable situations. These small acts of delay trained my mind to override the tyranny of immediate impulses and consider longer-term consequences. The sundial in my garden became a daily reminder that time is our most precious resource, and how we use it reveals our character. Those who consistently sacrifice future benefits for present pleasures remain perpetually weak, while those who can delay gratification build the strength to shape their destiny. Asterisk. The golden throne of Rome was perhaps the most magnificent seat ever crafted by human hands, inlaid with precious stones from every corner of the empire, carved with scenes of triumph and glory, cushioned with silks that cost more than most citizens earned in a lifetime. It was designed to overwhelm the senses and inspire awe in all who beheld it. Yet every time I sat upon it, I felt not power, but a test of my character. I came to understand that luxury is not merely excessive comfort. It is spiritual poison that slowly corrupts the soul. Like a toxin that accumulates in the body over time, luxury gradually weakens our capacity for virtue, courage, and clear thinking. The more we surround ourselves with ease and abundance, the more we lose our ability to function effectively when those comforts are removed. In my early years as emperor, I experimented with embracing the luxuries of my position. I reasoned that, since I bore the enormous burdens of leadership, I deserved some compensation in the form of material comfort. I allowed myself to be served elaborate meals prepared by master chefs. I wore robes of the finest fabrics. I surrounded myself with beautiful objects and pleasant environments. For a time, this seemed reasonable and even beneficial, but I began to notice subtle changes in my character. Decisions that should have been straightforward became more difficult when they required me to leave my comfortable chambers. Physical discomfort, which I had previously endured without complaint during my military service, now seemed intolerable. My expectations for comfort steadily increased, and my tolerance for inconvenience steadily decreased. I was becoming spiritually soft. The turning point came during a particularly harsh winter, when I needed to travel to inspect border defenses. The journey required sleeping in basic military quarters, eating simple rations, and enduring bitter cold. What shocked me was how much more difficult this journey had become compared to similar trips I had made as a younger officer. My body had not significantly changed, but my spirit had been weakened by months of luxury. I realized that luxury operates like a drug. It requires ever-increasing doses to produce the same satisfaction, while simultaneously reducing our ability to find contentment in simpler pleasures. The emperor who requires increasingly elaborate entertainments to feel amused has lost the capacity for simple joy. The person who needs constantly upgraded material possessions to feel successful has become enslaved to external validation. This understanding led me to make a conscious choice to reject luxury not as punishment, but as spiritual training. I began sleeping on simple beds, eating basic foods, and wearing plain clothes whenever possible. I discovered that this was not deprivation, it was liberation. When you are not dependent on luxury for your sense of well-being, you become free to function effectively in any environment. The contrast between appreciation and attachment became crucial to my practice. I could appreciate beauty, craftsmanship, and comfort when they were present, but I did not become attached to them. I could enjoy a well-prepared meal without needing such meals to feel satisfied. I could admire beautiful art without requiring beautiful surroundings to feel content. This distinction allowed me to engage with the material world without being enslaved by it. I observed that those around me who indulged most heavily in luxury became the weakest leaders. Senators who required elaborate comfort were ineffective during crises. Generals who had grown accustomed to luxury were poor commanders in the field. Citizens who pursued material abundance often lost their capacity for civic virtue and personal courage. Luxury was systematically weakening the very people who most needed strength. Voluntary simplicity became my antidote to luxury's poison. I chose basic options when elaborate ones were available. I practiced doing without things I could easily afford. I trained myself to find satisfaction in virtue rather than possessions. This practice didn't make me ascetic or joyless. It made me stronger and more capable of appreciating genuine pleasures when they naturally arose. The Golden Throne taught me that true power comes not from what you can command, but from what you can do without. The emperor who requires luxury to feel imperial is actually enslaved by his own possessions. But the leader who can maintain dignity and effectiveness regardless of circumstances possesses unshakable strength. When my son Commodus began showing signs of the character flaws that would eventually destroy him, I understood with painful clarity how emotional slavery develops and spreads. I watched as his pursuit of pleasure created a cycle of emotional dependence that made him increasingly weak, reactive, and ultimately tyrannical. The broken chains I envisioned around him were not physical bonds, but the emotional slavery that comes from being driven by desires rather than guided by wisdom. Emotional slavery begins when we allow our feelings to dictate our actions. The person who acts because they feel angry becomes a slave to anger. The individual who seeks pleasure because they feel bored becomes enslaved to stimulation. The leader who makes decisions based on what feels good in the moment becomes a prisoner of their own emotional impulses. This slavery is often invisible to those trapped within it, because it feels like freedom, the freedom to follow every feeling and impulse. But I learned through careful observation that emotional freedom comes from the opposite approach, feeling emotions fully while choosing actions based on wisdom rather than impulse. The Stoics taught me that we cannot control what emotions arise, but we can control how we respond to them. This distinction between feeling and acting became the foundation of my emotional discipline. I remember a particular incident during negotiations with Germanic tribal leaders when my initial emotional response nearly caused a diplomatic disaster. The tribal chief made a comment that I perceived as deeply insulting to Roman honor. My immediate emotional reaction was Rajai wanted to end the negotiations and prepare for military action. The feeling was so strong it seemed to demand immediate expression. But I had learned to create space between feeling and action. Instead of responding from anger, I excused myself for a few moments of private reflection. In that space, I asked myself, what response would serve the empire's interests? What action would demonstrate strength rather than weakness? How would a wise leader handle this situation? When I returned to the negotiations, I was able to respond from wisdom rather than emotion, and we ultimately reached an agreement that served both peoples well. This experience taught me that emotional slavery creates weakness in multiple ways. First, it makes us predictable and numerous, can manipulate us by triggering emotional responses. Second, it impairs our judgment. Decisions made from intense emotions are rarely optimal. Third, it creates dependency. We become addicted to emotional highs and lows rather than finding stability in virtue. Fourth, it reduces our credibility. People lose respect for leaders who are visibly controlled by their emotions. The cycle of emotional slavery often begins with pleasure seeking. When we use external pleasures to manage our internal emotional states, we train ourselves to be helpless without those pleasures. The person who requires alcohol to feel confident becomes emotionally dependent on drinking. The individual who needs constant entertainment to feel content loses the ability to find peace in solitude. The leader who seeks approval to feel secure becomes enslaved to others' opinions. I developed specific practices for maintaining emotional independence. Each morning, I would prepare myself mentally for the emotional challenges of the day, deciding in advance how I would respond to likely provocations. When strong emotions arose, I practiced observing them like weather passing through the sky, acknowledging their presence without being compelled to act on them. In the evening, I would review moments when emotions had influenced my decisions, learning from both my successes and failures. The most profound discovery was that emotional independence actually allows for deeper and more authentic emotional experiences. When you are not driven by emotions, you can appreciate them more fully. When you are not addicted to emotional highs, you can find contentment in steady states. When you are not afraid of emotional pain, you can love more deeply and risk more. Authentically, I learned to distinguish between natural emotional responses and manufactured emotional needs. Grief at the loss of a loved one is natural and should be honored, but needing constant excitement to feel alive is manufactured and weakens character. Fear in the face of genuine danger is natural and useful, but anxiety about circumstances beyond our control is manufactured and should be managed through wisdom. The ultimate goal is not emotional numbness, but emotional sovereignty, the ability to feel deeply while acting wisely. This sovereignty transforms apparent emotional weaknesses into actual strengths. The leader who can remain calm under pressure inspires confidence. The person who can feel anger without being controlled by it gains respect. The individual who can experience disappointment without being derailed by it demonstrates resilience. The gladiatorial games in the Colosseum represented everything I despised about pleasure-seeking, taken to its logical conclusion. Citizens would gather by the thousands to watch men kill each other for entertainment, their bloodlust growing more intense with each spectacle. The rusted sword I kept from those arenas served as a reminder of how the pursuit of physical pleasure inevitably leads to mental and moral degradation. What troubled me most about the games was not just their brutality, but how they revealed the connection between physical indulgence and intellectual deterioration. The crowds that screamed for blood were the same citizens who had grown soft from material comfort, weak from physical ease, and mentally lazy from constant entertainment. Their appetite for increasingly violent spectacles was directly proportional to their overall spiritual weakness. I began to understand that the mind and body are not separate entities, but interconnected aspects of a single system. When we indulge the body excessively, we inevitably weaken the mind. When we allow physical desires to drive our decisions, we diminish our capacity for clear thinking, moral reasoning, and sustained intellectual effort. The relationship is not merely symbolic, it is neurological and practical. Consider how physical pleasure affects mental performance. I observed that senators who indulged heavily in food and wine during the day struggled to think clearly during afternoon sessions. Military officers who spent their evenings in brothels and taverns were less sharp during morning strategy meetings. Citizens who constantly sought physical comfort became less capable of handling intellectual challenges or moral dilemmas. The pattern became unmistakable. Physical indulgence creates mental fog. When the body is constantly processing rich foods, alcohol, or recovering from sensory overload, the mind cannot operate at peak efficiency. When physical desires dominate our attention, mental resources are diverted from higher functions like planning, analysis, and creative problem solving. But the degradation goes deeper than mere distraction. Constant physical pleasure seeking actually rewires the brain to expect immediate gratification and to avoid anything that requires sustained mental effort. The person accustomed to instant physical satisfaction struggles with delayed intellectual rewards. The individual who constantly seeks sensory stimulation loses the ability to appreciate subtle thoughts, complex ideas, or nuanced emotions. I developed a personal practice of physical discipline specifically to maintain mental sharpness. I would regularly fast to keep my mind clear and focused. I practiced enduring cold, heat, and physical discomfort to strengthen my mental resilience. I engaged in challenging physical activities that required mental discipline not for pleasure, but for the mental benefits that came from physical self-mastery. The contrast with those around me was striking. While my courtiers grew softer and less capable with each passing year of indulgence, my own mental faculties remained sharp and reliable. When crises arose, I could think clearly while others were clouded by the after-effects of their physical excesses. During long negotiations or complex strategic planning, my mental endurance far exceeded that of advisors who had weakened themselves through physical indulgence. I realized that true physical pleasure, the deep satisfaction that comes from a healthy, disciplined body, is actually incompatible with the pursuit of physical pleasure. The strongest, most capable, most physically satisfying experiences come from training, discipline, and the mastery of physical challenges. The warrior who has conditioned his body through rigorous training experiences, physical confidence, and capability that no amount of sensual indulgence can provide. The gladiatorial games taught me that societies, like individuals, can become addicted to increasingly intense physical stimulation. What starts as harmless entertainment gradually escalates to require more extreme experiences to produce the same satisfaction. The citizens who once enjoyed simple theatrical performances eventually demanded blood sports. The person who begins with moderate physical pleasures eventually requires increasingly intense experiences to feel satisfied. I established new policies limiting the brutality of public entertainment, not from softness, but from strength. I understood that allowing citizens to degrade themselves through violent spectacles weakened the entire empire. A population addicted to physical excitement becomes incapable of the sustained mental effort required for civilization, governance, and cultural advancement. Physical discipline became one of my most important tools for maintaining mental clarity and moral strength. By training my body to be strong, resilient, and capable of functioning well under challenging conditions, I maintained a mind that could think clearly, reason effectively, and make wise decisions regardless of circumstances. The rusted gladiator's sword reminded me daily that the culminative mental degradation through physical indulgence leads inevitably to weakness, cruelty, and the collapse of everything worth preserving. The bronze scales of justice that adorned my court became a powerful symbol of a profound discovery I made during my years as emperor. Virtue provides deeper, more lasting satisfaction than any physical pleasure ever could. This was not merely a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that I experienced countless times when choosing right action over easy gratification. I remember the first time I truly felt what the Stoics called the pleasure of virtue. A wealthy merchant had offered me an enormous bribe to overlook his tax evasion enough gold to fund a military campaign. The physical pleasure of accepting would have been immediate. The satisfaction of wealth, the ease of having additional resources, the sensual appeal of beautiful objects that money could buy. But instead, I chose to uphold justice, ensuring he paid his rightful taxes and faced appropriate consequences. The satisfaction I felt from that decision was unlike any pleasure I had experienced. It wasn't the brief, fading rush of sensory gratification, but a deep, sustained sense of rightness that seemed to strengthen rather than weaken me. I felt aligned with my deepest values, connected to something larger than my immediate desires, and proud of who I was choosing to become. This satisfaction lasted not minutes or hours, but years, still drew strength from that memory decades later. This experience taught me that there are fundamentally different types of pleasure. Physical pleasures are temporary, requiring constant renewal, and often followed by regret or emptiness. But the pleasure of virtue is cumulative. Each right action builds upon the last, creating a foundation of satisfaction that grows stronger over time. The neurochemistry of meaningful action produces sustained well-being that no external pleasure can match. I began to study this phenomenon systematically when I chose courage over comfort during dangerous military campaigns. I felt a deep satisfaction that no luxury could provide. When I practiced patience during tedious administrative work instead of seeking entertainment, I experienced a sense of accomplishment that was more rewarding than any amusement. When I showed justice to difficult people rather than taking the easier path of favoritism, I felt a rightness that surpassed any physical gratification. The pattern became clear. Virtue produces the very satisfaction that people mistakenly seek. Through pleasure, we want to feel good about ourselves, to experience meaning and purpose, to feel strong and capable, to be proud of who we are. These desires are natural and healthy, but seeking their fulfillment through external pleasures is like trying to quench thirst. With salt water, it temporarily seems to help, while actually making the problem worse. Virtue, on the other hand, directly addresses these deep human needs. Courage makes us feel genuinely strong. Wisdom gives us real understanding. Justice connects us to something larger than ourselves. Temperance provides authentic self-control. These experiences satisfy at a level that physical pleasure cannot reach because they fulfill our nature as rational, moral beings rather than merely as pleasure-seeking animals. I discovered that the pleasure of virtue also makes us more attractive to others in the deepest sense. People are naturally drawn to those who embody strength, wisdom, and integrity. The leader who chooses virtue over pleasure gains a kind of magnetic authority that no amount of wealth or status can provide. The person who consistently acts from principle rather than impulse becomes someone others want to follow, respect, and emulate. But perhaps most importantly, the pleasure of virtue is sustainable and renewable. Physical pleasures require external resources, food, drink, entertainment, possessions. But virtue can be practiced anywhere, anytime, regardless of circumstances. The prisoner can be courageous, the poor person can be generous, the powerless individual can be wise. Virtue is the only pleasure that becomes more accessible as we practice it, rather than requiring ever greater resources to maintain. I made virtue my primary source of satisfaction, and found that this choice transformed not only my experience of pleasure, but my entire approach to life. Instead of asking what will feel good, I learned to ask what is the right thing to do. Instead of seeking situations that would provide pleasure, I looked for opportunities to practice virtue. Instead of avoiding discomfort, I embraced it as a chance to build character. This shift revealed the great paradox of pleasure-seeking. Those who chase physical pleasure remain perpetually unsatisfied, while those who pursue virtue find themselves genuinely fulfilled. The pleasure of virtue is not just morally superior to physical pleasure, it is actually more pleasurable, more lasting, and more conducive to human flourishing. The ancient Senate decree that granted me absolute power over the Roman Empire came with an invisible warning that I didn't fully understand until years later. Power itself is a form of pleasure that can corrupt just as thoroughly as wine, wealth, or any other indulgence. The corruption of leadership through pleasure-seeking is perhaps the most dangerous weakness of all, because it affects not just the individual, but everyone under their influence. I observed this corruption in senators, governors, and military commanders throughout the empire. Men who had once been virtuous and capable would gradually change after gaining authority. The ability to command others, to have their wishes immediately fulfilled, to be constantly flattered and served. These experiences created a kind of intoxication that was more destructive than any physical pleasure because it was so subtle and seemingly justified. The pattern was always the same. A capable person would be promoted to a position of authority. Initially, they would use their power responsibly, focusing on their duties and the welfare of those under their command. But gradually, the pleasure of being obeyed, the satisfaction of having their preferences immediately accommodated, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who sought to please them, would begin to change their character. I watched governors who had once lived simply begin demanding elaborate accommodations. Military commanders who had shared hardships with their soldiers started requiring special privileges and comforts. Senators who had once debated policies seriously became more interested in the ceremonial aspects of their positions and the respect their offices commanded. Power had become a drug, and they were becoming addicts. The most insidious aspect of this corruption was how it destroyed the very capabilities that had made these people effective leaders in the first place. The governor who required luxury lost his ability to understand his subjects' hardships. The commander who separated himself from his soldiers' experiences lost their respect and loyalty. The senator who became intoxicated with ceremony lost focus on actual governance. I realized that my own position as emperor made me particularly vulnerable to this corruption. Every day, hundreds of people worked to anticipate my needs, fulfill my wishes, and make my life as pleasant as possible. This constant stream of accommodation could easily become a form of pleasure that would weaken my judgment and separate me from the reality of governing effectively. To protect myself from this corruption, I established strict personal rules about the use of my power. One insisted on maintaining some tasks that I could have easily delegated, not because they were crucial, but because they kept me connected to practical realities. I regularly sought out uncomfortable truths from advisors who were willing to disagree with me. I made a practice of spending time with ordinary citizens who would speak honestly rather than flatteringly. Most importantly, I learned to find pleasure in the responsibility of power rather than its privileges. Instead of enjoying the fact that others served me, I focused on how I could serve them more effectively. Instead of savoring the respect my position commanded, I concentrated on becoming worthy of that respect through my actions. Instead of taking pleasure in being obeyed, I took satisfaction in giving orders that genuinely benefited those who followed them. This shift in perspective revealed that true leadership requires the constant rejection of power's pleasures. The leader who enjoys commanding others becomes tyrannical. The person who takes pleasure in being served becomes disconnected from those they lead. The individual who savors the respect their position commands loses the humility. necessary for good judgment. I discovered that the most effective leaders are those who bear authority as a burden rather than enjoy it as a pleasure. They make difficult decisions not because it feels good to exercise power, but because those decisions serve the greater good. They maintain their positions not because they enjoy the privileges, but because they feel obligated to fulfill their responsibilities. The corruption of power through pleasure-seeking explains why so many capable people become ineffective once they gain authority. It also explains why the best leaders are often reluctant leaders, those who accept power not because they desire its pleasures, but because they recognize the necessity of someone fulfilling its duties. My experience taught me that leadership itself is a form of character test. Every day, power offers the pleasure of self-indulgence, and every day, effective leadership requires choosing service over satisfaction, responsibility over privilege, and the welfare of others over personal comfort. Those who fail this test may retain their positions, but they lose their ability to lead effectively. The carved skull that sat on my desk was not a morbid decoration, but a profound teacher. This memento mori reminder of death served as my daily instructor in the ultimate futility of pleasure-seeking and the supreme importance of character. Death, I discovered, is the most honest philosopher, stripping away all illusions and revealing what truly matters in human life. When I contemplated my own mortality each morning, the artificial urgency of most pleasures simply evaporated. The elaborate meal that seemed so important became a brief biological necessity. The comfortable bed that promised such satisfaction became merely a place to rest temporarily. The entertainment that appeared so compelling became a distraction from more meaningful activities. Death's perspective revealed most pleasures as essentially trivial, but this contemplation of mortality did not make me morose or passive. The opposite. When you truly accept that your time is limited and uncertain, every moment becomes precious, and you naturally want to spend those moments on what genuinely matters. Death taught me to ask constantly, if I died tonight, would I be proud of how I spent today? Would my actions today contribute to something lasting and meaningful? I remember a specific evening when this practice saved me from a significant mistake. I had been invited to an elaborate banquet that promised exceptional food, wine, and entertainment. The prospect was genuinely appealing after a difficult day of dealing with political challenges and administrative burdens. But as I prepared to attend, I glanced at the skull on my desk and asked myself, if this were my last evening alive, is this how I would choose to spend it? The answer was immediately clear: no. If I truly had only hours left to live, I would want to spend them in meaningful conversation with loved ones, in quiet contemplation of what I had learned and accomplished, or in writing something valuable for future generations. The banquet's pleasures, however refined, would be a waste of precious time. I declined the invitation and spent that evening writing some of my most important philosophical reflections. This practice of imagining death taught me that pleasure-seeking is often an unconscious denial of mortality. We pursue pleasures as if we have unlimited time, as if the experiences and possessions we accumulate could somehow make us permanent. But death reveals the truth. Nothing external survives, and only the character we build and the good we do has any lasting significance. The plague years had given me direct experience with death's teachings. I watched thousands of people die, including friends, advisors, and family members. In their final moments, I never heard anyone express regret about pleasures they had missed or comforts they had been denied. Instead, their regrets centered on relationships neglected, duties unfulfilled, and opportunities to do good that they had let pass by. Those who faced death most peacefully were invariably those who had built their lives on virtue rather than pleasure. They could look back on their time with satisfaction because they had used it well. They could face the end without desperation because they had lived with purpose. They could accept mortality because they had built something: character, relationships, contributions that would outlast their physical existence. Death also taught me that the fear of missing out on pleasures is fundamentally irrational. You cannot experience pleasure when you are dead, so no amount of pleasure-seeking can truly prepare you for that reality. But you can build character that makes the prospect of death less frightening because you know you have lived well. You can create meaning that makes life feel complete regardless of when it ends. I developed the practice of weekly death meditations, imagining in detail what my final moments might be like and asking whether my current priorities would leave me satisfied with my life's trajectory. These exercises consistently revealed that pursuing virtue provided far more peace and satisfaction than pursuing pleasure. The skull on my desk became my wisest counselor. It reminded me that emperors and slaves face the same ultimate fate, that power and wealth provide no exemption from mortality, and that the only rational response to life's brevity is to focus on what truly matters. In the face of death's certainty, the choice between pleasure and virtue becomes obvious. Pleasure dies with the body, but virtue creates something that transcends individual mortality. Most people avoid thinking about death because they find it depressing, but I discovered the opposite effect. Regular contemplation of mortality made life more vivid, decisions clearer, and priorities more rational. Death became not my enemy, but my teacher. Not a source of fear, but a guide to wisdom. Asterisk, asterisk, on a simple pottery fragment that I kept among my most treasured possessions, I had written a note to myself that captured one of the most powerful principles I ever learned. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This ostracon became my daily reminder that true strength comes not from controlling circumstances, but from accepting what cannot be changed while taking full responsibility for what can be. The revelation of acceptance as strength came to me during one of the most challenging periods of my reign. A severe drought had lasted 3 years, causing widespread famine throughout the empire. Traditional Roman thinking demanded that an emperor control such situations, that through proper planning, resource allocation, and sheer force of will, any problem could be solved. But I was learning a different kind of power. I spent months fighting against the reality of the drought, organizing increasingly desperate measures to bring rain or transport grain from distant provinces. The more I fought against circumstances beyond my control, the more frustrated, exhausted, and ineffective I became. My resistance to reality was consuming energy that could have been used more productively, and my emotional state was affecting my ability to make good decisions about what I could actually influence. The breakthrough came when I stopped fighting the fact of the drought and started accepting it as a given condition within which I needed to operate. Instead of wasting energy on what I could not control, the weathery, focused entirely on what I could control, the empire's response to the weather. This shift from resistance to acceptance immediately clarified my thinking and multiplied my effectiveness. I realized that most human suffering comes not from difficult circumstances themselves, but from our resistance to those circumstances. The person who cannot accept job loss suffers far more than the objective situation requires. The individual who fights against aging experiences more pain than the physical changes actually cause. The leader who cannot accept setbacks wastes energy that could be used to create solutions. Acceptance is not passive resignation or giving up on improvement. It is the foundation for effective action. When you accept current reality completely, you can see it clearly and respond to it wisely. When you stop wasting energy fighting what cannot be changed, you have more resources available for changing what can be influenced. When you embrace what is, you gain the clarity to envision what could be. I developed specific practices for cultivating this strength of acceptance. Each morning, I would mentally review the challenges facing the empire and carefully distinguish between what was within my control and what was not. For everything outside my control, other people's actions, natural disasters, past events, future uncertainties, practiced radical acceptance. For everything within my control, my decisions, my effort, my responses, my character, I took complete responsibility. This practice transformed my experience of leadership. Instead of feeling frustrated by senators who opposed my policies, I accepted their opposition as a given and focused on persuading them more effectively. Instead of being stressed by military setbacks, I accepted them as part of warfare and concentrated on learning from them and adapting strategy. Instead of being disturbed by criticism, I accepted it as inevitable for public figures and used it as information for improvement. The strength that comes from acceptance extends far beyond practical effectiveness. There is a profound peace that arises when you stop fighting reality and start working with it. The constant tension of resistance dissolves, replaced by a calm alertness that allows for much clearer thinking and more appropriate responses. You begin to move through challenges like water flowing around rocks, rather than like a battering ram trying to break through walls. I learned that acceptance also reveals opportunities that resistance obscures. When I stopped fighting the drought and accepted it as reality, I discovered innovative solutions that I had been too frustrated to see earlier. When I accepted that some senators would always oppose my initiatives, I found ways to work around their opposition and even turn it to advantage. When I accepted that military campaigns would involve setbacks, I became better at preparing for and learning from difficulties. The pottery fragment with my note became a daily touchstone for this practice. Every time I felt the familiar tension of fighting against circumstances, I would read those words and redirect my energy from resistance to acceptance, from trying to control the uncontrollable to taking full responsibility for what was truly mine to influence. This strength of acceptance ultimately taught me that the most powerful position is not trying to control everything, but accepting everything while controlling yourself completely. The emperor who can accept defeat while controlling his response to it is stronger than the emperor who tries to prevent all defeats but falls apart when they inevitably occur. The person who can accept hardship while maintaining virtue is more resilient than the person who tries to avoid all difficulties but crumbles when comfort is removed. Asterisk. The eternal flame of Vesta burned continuously in Rome for over 1,000 years, symbolizing principles that transcend any particular era or civilization. As I reflect on how the Stoic understanding of pleasure and weakness applies to your modern world, I see that the same fundamental dynamics that governed human nature in ancient Rome operate today. Though the specific forms of temptation have evolved dramatically, in my time, the greatest threats to character came from material luxury, political power, and sensory indulgence. In your era, I observe new forms of pleasure-seeking that would have been incomprehensible to ancient Romans, but follow identical patterns of weakness creation. The instant gratification available through your digital devices mirrors the immediate satisfaction that wealthy Romans sought through elaborate entertainments. The constant stimulation of your social media platforms parallels the circus games that kept our citizens distracted from deeper purposes. Your modern world has created unprecedented opportunities for pleasure-seeking that would have amazed even the most decadent Roman emperor. You can access virtually any entertainment instantly, communicate with anyone globally, and satisfy most desires with minimal effort. Yet I observe that these advances have not made your generation happier, stronger, or more fulfilled than previous generations, often quite the opposite. The principle I learned about delayed gratification becomes even more crucial in your context. When everything can be obtained immediately, the ability to wait, to work, and to sacrifice for longer-term benefits becomes a rare and valuable skill. Those who can resist the constant pull of instant gratification gain enormous advantages over those who cannot. The professional who can focus deeply for hours without checking messages develops capabilities that distracted colleagues never achieve. Your culture of consumption represents a sophisticated version of the luxury that I saw weaken Roman citizens. The constant pressure to acquire new products, upgrade existing possessions, and define yourself through material goods creates the same spiritual softness that I observed in wealthy Romans. Those who can find satisfaction in simplicity and focus on character development rather than acquisition possess a strength that consumer culture cannot touch. I am particularly struck by how your social media platforms exploit the same weaknesses that Roman politicians used to manipulate citizens: the desire for approval, the addiction to stimulation, the need for constant validation. These vulnerabilities make people as controllable today as they were 2,000 years ago. Those who can build their self-worth on virtue rather than external validation become unconquerable in ways that apply to both ancient and modern challenges. The principles of physical discipline remain equally relevant in your sedentary era. Where Romans might have been weakened by excessive luxury and indulgence, modern people face weakness through physical inactivity and comfort-seeking. The office worker who maintains physical fitness and can endure discomfort possesses practical advantages in focus, energy, and resilience that soft colleagues lack. Your information environment presents unique challenges that amplify ancient problems. The constant stream of news, opinion, and stimulation can create an addiction to mental excitement that parallels the Roman appetite for increasingly dramatic entertainment. Those who can maintain mental clarity in this environment, who can think independently and focus deeply, gain capabilities that distracted minds cannot match. The Stoic practice of negative visualization becomes even more powerful in your context of material abundance. Regularly imagining the loss of your technological conveniences, material possessions, and comfortable circumstances builds appreciation for what you have while reducing dependence on external conditions for happiness. This mental training prepares you for inevitable changes and setbacks, while increasing gratitude for present circumstances. Most importantly, the fundamental choice between pleasure and virtue remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Rome. Your culture may pressure you toward immediate gratification, but the same character-building practices that created strength in Roman citizens can create strength in modern people. The daily choice to do what is right rather than what feels good, to pursue meaningful goals rather than easy pleasures, to build character rather than accumulate experiences. These decisions create the same kind of inner strength that sustained philosophers and emperors through the greatest challenges. The eternal flame reminds us that certain principles never become obsolete, because they address unchanging aspects of human nature. The technology changes, the specific temptations evolve, but the fundamental dynamics of strength and weakness, virtue and vice, character and corruption remain constant across all eras. Those who understand and apply these timeless principles will possess advantages in any century, while those who ignore them will struggle regardless of their external circumstances. Asterisk. The simple woolen cloak I wore during my philosophical practices was deliberately uncomfortable, coarse, unlined, and inadequate for Rome's winter weather. While my courtiers dressed in fine silks and soft furs, I chose this rough garment as a tool for building character. This practice of voluntary discomfort became one of my most powerful methods for developing the strength to handle life's inevitable challenges. Most people naturally avoid discomfort and seek ease wherever possible. This instinct serves us well in truly dangerous situations, but in our daily lives, it often works against our development. When we consistently choose comfort over challenge, softness over hardness, ease over effort. We gradually lose our capacity to handle difficulties when they inevitably arise. Voluntary discomfort is the antidote to this weakness. I developed this practice after observing how quickly soldiers deteriorated when they were stationed in comfortable garrisons rather than challenging frontier posts. Men who had been tough, reliable fighters would become soft and ineffective after months of easy living. The comfort that seemed like a reward for their service actually undermined their capability to serve effectively. I realized the same principle applied to emperors and philosophers. My practice began with simple physical discomforts. I would sometimes sleep on the floor instead of my bed, eat plain bread when elaborate meals were available, walk when carriages were offered, and wear simple clothes when fine garments were provided. These weren't punishments, but training exercises, like a soldier practicing with heavy weapons to make actual combat feel easier by comparison. The key insight was that voluntary discomfort must be truly voluntary. When hardship is imposed upon us, we naturally resist it and often become bitter. But when we choose discomfort deliberately, for a purpose, it becomes a source of strength rather than suffering. The same cold water that feels torturous when you fall into it accidentally can feel invigorating when you choose to plunge in deliberately. I discovered that this practice worked on multiple levels. Physically, it increased my tolerance for genuine hardships when they occurred. Mentally, it strengthened my willpower and self-discipline. Emotionally, it reduced my attachment to comfort and increased my appreciation for simple pleasures. Spiritually, it connected me to the Stoic principle that virtue is the only true good, and that external circumstances are fundamentally neutral. The practice of negative visualization became central to this training. I would regularly imagine losing everything I possessed: my empire, my health, my loved ones, my life itself. Then I would practice feeling genuinely accepting of these imagined losses. This mental exercise prepared me emotionally for real setbacks, while increasing my gratitude for present circumstances. One particular winter, I decided to live for a full month exactly as my soldiers did on campaign, sleeping in a simple tent, eating basic rations, wearing standard military gear, and following the same daily routine as ordinarily. My advisors were horrified, arguing that such treatment was beneath an emperor's dignity and might harm my health. But that month became one of the most valuable periods of my reign. I gained first-hand understanding of my soldiers' daily experiences, which made me a more effective military leader. I developed physical resilience that served me well in subsequent campaigns. Most importantly, I proved to myself that I could maintain my essential character and capabilities even when stripped of imperial comforts. The practice taught me to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured dependencies. I discovered that most of what I thought I needed for effectiveness and happiness were actually just habits of comfort that could be abandoned without any real loss. The emperor who requires luxury to feel imperial has made himself dependent on circumstances beyond his control. But the emperor who can maintain dignity and effectiveness in any conditions is truly free. Voluntary discomfort also revealed the profound pleasure that comes from overcoming challenges. When you deliberately choose hardship and then successfully endure it, you experience a satisfaction that no comfort can provide. This pleasure of self-mastery is sustainable, renewable, and always available regardless of external circumstances. I learned to apply this principle to mental and emotional challenges as well. I would deliberately engage with difficult people to practice patience, take on complex problems to strengthen my problem-solving abilities, and confront uncomfortable truths about myself to build self-awareness. These voluntary psychological discomforts built mental resilience, just as physical challenges built physical strength. The woolen cloak became my symbol of this practice, daily reminder that strength comes not from avoiding discomfort, but from choosing to embrace it purposefully. Every time I felt its coarse texture, I was reminded that the soft path leads to weakness, while the difficult path leads to capability, resilience, and genuine satisfaction. Asterisk, asterisk, the manuscript of my meditations was never intended for public consumption. These were private notes, written to myself during quiet moments in military campaigns and imperial duties, recording my thoughts on virtue, strength, and the proper way to live. Yet these personal reflections have outlasted the vast empire I ruled, proving a fundamental truth about what survives when everything else fades away. All the pleasures I could have pursued as emperor, the elaborate feasts, the magnificent entertainments, the luxurious possessions, the sensual indulgences, with my body, the physical empire I governed eventually crumbled. Its borders shifted, its institutions transformed beyond recognition. The wealth I commanded was redistributed. The power I wielded was transferred to others. The glory I achieved became historical memory. None of the external goods that people typically pursue had any permanence, but the character I built, the principles I developed, and the wisdom I gained through choosing virtue over pleasure created something that transcends individual mortality. My philosophical insights continue to influence people nearly to millennia after my death, not because of any imperial decree, but because truth has a kind of immortality that physical pleasure cannot achieve. This revelation about legacy fundamentally changed how I approached every decision. When faced with choices between immediate gratification and character development, I would ask myself, which choice contributes to something that will outlast my physical existence? The answer consistently pointed away from pleasure-seeking and toward virtue-building. I observed this principle in the lives of others as well. The senators who devoted their lives to accumulating wealth and enjoying luxury left no lasting impact there. Names are forgotten, their contributions meaningless. But the philosophers, teachers, and virtuous leaders who sacrificed immediate pleasures for character development created influences that persist across generations. Their strength multiplied rather than diminished with time. The pursuit of pleasure is inherently self-limiting because it focuses entirely on temporary experiences that die with the individual. But the pursuit of virtue creates expanding circles of influence that can affect countless people across vast periods of time. A single act of courage can inspire others to be brave. One example of integrity can influence standards of behavior for entire communities. A life devoted to wisdom can provide guidance for generations. I began to see that true legacy is not what people remember about you, but what you plant in others that continues to grow after you are gone. The emperor who seeks to be remembered for his conquests builds monuments to temporary achievements, but the person who builds character in themselves and inspires virtue in others creates something that multiplies indefinitely. This understanding gave profound meaning to everyday choices. When I chose discipline over indulgence, I wasn't just strengthening my own character, was modeling behavior that could influence my advisors, soldiers, and citizens. When I practiced virtue in difficult circumstances, I was demonstrating possibilities that others could follow. When I wrote honestly about my struggles with temptation and my commitment to philosophy, I was creating resources that could help future generations. The irony became clear. Those who seek immediate pleasure remain trapped in the temporary, while those who choose delayed gratification through virtue building create permanent contributions. The person obsessed with feeling good right now limits themselves to experiences that last minutes or hours. But the individual committed to being good creates influences that can last centuries. I realized that every human being has the opportunity to build this kind of lasting legacy, regardless of their position or circumstances. The parent who models integrity for their children, the teacher who inspires students to think clearly, the friend who demonstrates loyalty during difficult times, or creating influences that ripple forward through time. Character building is the one investment that always pays compound interest. My meditations became proof of this principle, written for my own improvement with no thought of publication. These private reflections on virtue and strength have influenced millions of people because they address universal human challenges. The strength I built through choosing virtue over pleasure enabled me to create something genuinely valuable that survives long after all the imperial pleasures have been forgotten. The manuscript reminds me daily that what we build in our character is the only currency that transcends mortality. Physical pleasure dies with the body, but virtue creates ripples of influence that can affect the world long after we are gone. The choice between pleasure and virtue is ultimately a choice between the temporary and the eternal, between self-limitation and infinite possibility. This perspective transforms every moment into an opportunity for legacy building. Each choice, to do right rather than feel good, to build character rather than seek comfort, to pursue virtue rather than pleasure, becomes an investment in something larger and more lasting than individual existence. Asterisk. The philosopher's staff that guided ancient thinkers on their journeys toward wisdom represents the path that now lies before you. Every principle I have shared, from the discipline of desire to the strength of acceptance, is not merely historical curiosity, but practical wisdom that you can apply immediately to build genuine strength in your own life. The choice between pleasure and virtue that defined my reign as emperor is the same choice that will define your character and your destiny. Begin with the foundation. Recognize that seeking pleasure makes you weak because it trains you to be dependent on external circumstances for your well-being. Every time you choose immediate gratification over long-term benefit, you reinforce neural pathways that make you less capable of handling life's inevitable challenges. Every time you avoid discomfort when you could choose to embrace it, you miss an opportunity to build resilience that will serve you when difficulties arise uninvited. Start your practice with small, daily decisions. When you feel hungry, wait a few minutes before eating to practice delayed gratification. When you're comfortable in bed, get up immediately when your alarm sounds, instead of indulging in extra comfort. When you face a choice between an easy path and a more challenging but beneficial one, choose difficulty deliberately. These micro decisions create macro character over time. Develop your inner citadel through morning reflection and evening review. Each day, spend time identifying what is within your control and what is not, taking full responsibility for your choices while accepting circumstances beyond your influence. Each evening, examine your decisions and ask whether they contributed to strength or weakness, virtue or vice. This daily practice builds the philosophical foundation for all other improvements. Create your own version of negative visualization by regularly imagining the loss of comforts you take for granted. Spend time considering how you would maintain your essential character if you lost your job, your health, your possessions, or your current relationships. This mental preparation reduces anxiety about potential losses while increasing gratitude for present circumstances. Practice voluntary discomfort systematically. Choose to walk when you could drive. Eat simple food when elaborate options are available. Embrace cold when you could seek warmth. Maintain silence when you could seek entertainment. These practices build tolerance for involuntary discomfort while breaking your dependence on constant comfort. Focus intensely on the pleasure that comes from virtue rather than seeking virtue for external rewards. Notice how courage feels when you face fears directly. Observe the satisfaction that comes from keeping commitments even when it's difficult. Pay attention to the deep contentment that follows acts of genuine kindness or justice. Train yourself to recognize and appreciate these internal rewards that no external force can take away. Apply these principles to modern challenges specifically. When social media tempts you toward constant stimulation. Practice sustained focus on single tasks. When consumer culture pressures you to define yourself through possessions, find identity in character development instead. When your culture promotes immediate gratification, build the rare ability to work toward long-term goals without needing constant positive feedback. Remember that this is a lifetime journey, not a destination to reach. I practiced these principles for decades and still found new applications and deeper understanding with each passing year. The goal is not perfection, but consistent improvement. Not the elimination of all pleasure, but the wisdom to distinguish between pleasures that strengthen and those that weaken. Build community around these principles by finding others who value character development over pleasure seeking. Share your journey with people who will support your choices to embrace difficulty and pursue virtue. Be willing to model these principles for others who may be inspired by your example to begin their own philosophical practice. Most importantly, understand that every moment offers a new opportunity to choose strength over weakness. The past does not define you, only your current choices matter. Whether you have spent years seeking pleasure or have already begun building virtue, today's decisions determine tomorrow's character. The path of the philosopher is always available, always challenging, and always rewarding for those willing to walk it. The staff that guides this journey is your commitment to truth, virtue, and strength over comfort, pleasure, and ease. Take up this staff, begin this path, and discover for yourself the profound satisfaction that comes from building unshakable character in a world that constantly tempts you toward weakness. The choice is yours, and the choice is now.